Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Global Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's special lecture by Dr. Katarzyna Person in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Before we start today's program, I would like to share a few words about the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC, or the Joint, which is the leading Jewish humanitarian organization. Our collections include millions of documents, 150,000 photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Our Holocaust-era records are especially extensive because JDC was helping Jews in every corner of the world during that period. These materials are among the most frequently used in our collections by scholars from around the world, as well as publishers, journalists, curators, filmmakers, and family researchers. We also offer fellowships that support scholars conducted research in the JDC archives. Our speaker today, Dr. Katarzyna Person, is the recipient of one of these fellowships, the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship. This fellowship was established in 2012 in tribute to Ellen Lewis, a German Jewish refugee who worked for JDC in Shanghai and later in New York. Dr. Person is a historian of the Holocaust and the director of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. She holds a PhD from the University of London. She is the author of several major works on the Holocaust, including studies of the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish policing under Nazi occupation, post-war justice, and the experiences of Polish Jews in the American and British zones of Germany after the war. Her most recent book is The Hour of Revenge: Holocaust Survivors and Their Search for Revenge and Retribution. It was published by Toronto University Press in 2025, and it has just been shortlisted for the Jewish Book Council Awards. The title of her lecture today is Jewish Leadership in Small Communities in Poland During the Holocaust. Dr. Person will present for about 40 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted, but you can send us questions at any time during her lecture and during the Q&A via the Q&A function on Zoom. Dr. Person will now start her lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for having me. Thank you for this fellowship. And what I'll be talking about today is part of my work in progress in the social history of small ghettos, a topic which I think is especially important today. On the 27th of January, the topic that remains very much outside of the main narrative of the Holocaust is the one that we really should be remembering and talking about today. And I would like to thank JDC and other organizations which for the archives they keep, and thanks to which we can remember this story and can learn from it. The small ghettos, which I'm talking about today, will be classified according to pre-war Polish classifications as communities under 5,000 Jews. According to the USHM Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, there are about 580 ghettos in occupied Poland, which comprised of 5,000, less than 5,000 Jews, meaning they constitute the vast majority of ghettos in occupied Poland. 230 of them, so almost half, were those which had under 1,000 inhabitants. So these are very small villages, communities, which really represented the large share of the experience of the Holocaust, and which up to today remain very much on the margin of it for many reasons, We have studies of individual communities, but there's still, to this day, no comprehensive study of what it meant to live and then die in a small ghetto. And I hope that my research will one day fill that void. But if it is to be filled, it is to be filled on the base of archives such as the JDC, because there's very little, if anything else, left that can tell this story. I will look at it today through a prism which is very difficult on many levels, and that's the story of the Jewish councils, the Judenräte, in these ghettos. But I believe that if we are to fully understand the Jewish communal experience of the Holocaust, we have to understand the story of the Judenrat. In his preliminary and methodological aspects of research on the Judenrat, a Holocaust survivor and historian, Philip Friedman, wrote as following: "The ghetto teemed with activity. There were constant changes and development in his life. There were sudden metamorphoses and developments in the social and economic fabric. The changes were rapid and far-reaching. The development of the Jewish self-government was bound up with these processes. When one immerses oneself in the complex problem of the Judenrat, one must deal with all these social, economic, ethical, and psychological phenomena, as well as with all the organizational problems of the ghetto. It's only against such a background that events and developments can be understood. Another factor of paramount importance should be not overlooked, namely to what extent the success of the Nazi strategy depended upon Jewish representation and Jewish autonomy. When we look at the Judenrat today, we most often describe it for the last sentence of Friedman's study. So we look at it as a tool in the hands of the Nazis when it comes to implementation of the final solution of the Holocaust. But I think this is maybe not the question that we really should be asking. There are other questions that can be asked about the role of the Judenrat, and this is something that I will try to address today, and address it through the prism of small ghettos. So we'll not be only looking at the experience of Warsaw, Krakow, or Łódź, but also those places, the names of which are often completely unknown, and the story of which inhabitants are completely wiped out and silenced today. Judenrat, defined further on by Friedman as all forms of quasi-autonomous bodies imposed by Nazis on the Jewish communities, were, as you well know, but I will just quickly recap it for the sake of it, set up still during the military conquest of Poland. So on the 21st of September 1939, the famous Schnellbrief sent by Reinhard Heydrich to the Einsatzgruppen, he commanded the setting up of Jewish councils of elders, or the Jewish councils, which were to be, and now this sentence is really how we often look at the Judenrat, and which really constitute the very essence of its being in the eyes of the Nazi occupiers. They were to be, and I quote now, made fully responsible in the literal sense of the word, he writes further on, for the exact execution according to terms of all instructions released or yet to be released. I'll be talking today, because of the work of the period of work of JDC in occupied Poland, mainly about those Judenrat which were set up in territories occupied by the Germans in September 1939. So these are the communities where the Judenrat functions long before the establishment of the ghetto. But of course, we have to remember that the Judenrat were set up very differently, and they reflected different regional practices of Holocaust as they evolved over time. So they function differently in various areas of Poland, depending on at which point they were conquered, especially in territories occupied in the summer of 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, where Judenrat were set up in some spaces and some towns and cities, but not in all. In some places, which function only as holding areas for persons who were soon to be murdered, and they were very often administered by non-Jewish auxiliary forces. In the majority of towns and localities, the ghetto would function for a very short period of time before all of its inhabitants were murdered. In these cases, Judenrat were mainly set up in order to either, for some short period of time, organize forced labor, and then provide lists of names of inhabitants to be killed. And in those places, unlike in those areas which were occupied in September in 1939, the membership of the Judenrat did not guarantee even temporary protection. So in those areas that we know of, through which we look at the story, so mainly through Warsaw, where members of the Judenrat are really the last to be killed, in those areas they're actually often the first to be murdered. When examining the story of the Judenrat from the Jewish perspective, so looking at it as one of the experiences of victims of the Holocaust, the key question that we ask ourselves often deals with their membership. So the motivation of its members, the pressures they were under, and in the majority of cases in the ghettos that we're talking about, the Judenrat is built around a leader. We know, of course, of the most famous ones, such as Rumkowski or Adam Czerniaków, but that's the leader that is appointed by the local administration and then later approved by the Nazi official, and then the leader builds around them the Judenrat, which is basically acting as an advisory board, which is advising it on, which is responsible for various functions of the community. So, for example, in Warsaw, we have quite a large Judenrat with various departments responsible for different parts of work. Each of them has a different councillor as its head, and then Adam Czerniaków on top of it. And this is usually how we see the Judenrat. But of course, we must remember that it functions differently again in different communities, depending on their size. According to Heinrich's Schnell brief, the Judenrat was to be as far as possible composed of the remaining influential personalities and rabbis, and the size of the council was set at 24. But further on, in another decision by Hans Frank, by decree by Hans Frank, it was noted that this number only applies to communities over 10,000. So in the communities which we'll be talking about, those under 5,000, the Judenrat often functioned differently. It had a different number of people. It was meant to be composed of men, according to Schnellbrief, but again, as we know, there were also cases of women being on the Judenrat. In some cases, we had, for example, 2 leaders of the Judenrat. And we can already see it in JDC archives, in this document, which you can see here, coming from Bolimów. You have members of the Judenrat, and there's 4 members of the Judenrat. 2 of them, as you can see, coming from most likely one family. That's the Obmann, the head of the Judenrat, Motka Berman, and then we have his deputy, who is clearly a family member. We have a head of the financial officer, and then we have a secretary who is noted as a refugee from Zgierz. So we have only 4 people in Bolimów who are on the Judenrat. As a general rule, it can be claimed that the Judenrat established at the beginning of the occupation of Poland. So again, these which are usually appear in documents by the JDC are mainly composed of people who are members of pre-existing systems and structures of communal leadership. Of course, this strategy of enlisting elites was a well-known strategy which was used in order to project legitimacy, to strengthen the sense that the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, is basically a replacement of the old Jewish power structure, that is acting in the best interest of the community. But in many communities, especially in smaller communities, enlisting local elites, of course, strengthen the image of the Judenrat as a collaborationist body, where the local elites are making a deal with the occupier. This also happens in Warsaw. But this is especially important here, because in this document, which you can see here, we can see that members of the Judenrat are also noted as members of the Jewish self-help in this locality. And this is important. This is important. Why? Because in larger ghettos, like in Warsaw, and I'll be referring to Warsaw because that's the one we all know best, we usually talk about 3 main sources of power, 3 main places where power is concentrated. The first one is the Judenrat and the German Post Administration, the official administration in the ghetto, which consists of the Judenrat, all its agencies. It's usually huge, with a large number of people being employed, the Jewish police as well. So that's the first one. The second one is the charitable organizations, aid organizations, including Jewish self-help, which are linked to the underground very often, or to clandestine organizations. They again can be very powerful, mainly because of the fact that they are able to distribute aid from abroad. And in case of Warsaw, we even talk about the whole shadow, we can say whole shadow cabinet of when it comes to Jewish self-help. In a sense, they have all the same departments at the Judenrat, basically, and they are incredibly influential, in some parts more influential than Judenrat itself. And then the third one, which grows in strength over time, is the whole clandestine life in the ghetto, including in some cases also armed underground. So we have these three sources of power, which of course compete for goods, compete for provisions, but nonetheless they are present. In small ghettos like this, we can guess partly because there's also a smaller pool of people from which to choose, but maybe also for other reasons, it looks differently. So the Judenrat is the same as the self-help in this in Bolimov, and this also appears in other ghettos. This is Rudzienko, where again you have a number of the self-help committee, which consists, as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a note saying that I think 5 out of 7 members are members of the Judenrat, including the head of the Judenrat, and then the controlling commission also consists of 3 members of the Judenrat. So basically, all meager provisions and everything that the community has, all the resources of the community are controlled by this very small number of people. And we have again the situation here, the same in Inowodz, where we have a member of the Judenrat, the head of the Judenrat actually, who is on the aid commission, and then other members as well, which we can see on the remarks on the far right side of this document. And this, of course, leads to huge conflicts within the society community, and that's something that JDC also addresses when it comes to inspect those smaller communities. Over time, and as a result of evolution of Nazi policy, the composition of the Judenrat changes, and so those which are installed or reorganized later in the war are often selected directly by the Germans and tend to include more members drawn from the so-called new elite. In one of the diaries from small ghettos, we can read that these are quote-unquote new people. So at this time, of course, we know that the pre-war social mobility networks have already been replaced by entirely new system, by an entirely new wartime system of privilege and importance. And this happens in many large ghettos, as we know, but also in smaller ghettos. And that's something that's also addressed by the JDC, even though quite often, quite in a roundabout way. What we have here is a report from inspection which was carried out by the JDC in Chmielów, following a letter from one of its inhabitants. They talk about a soup kitchen which doesn't exist in this town, and then they say at the head of the council is a chairman Gutman, who does not have a good opinion among the community, and all the other members of the council are limited by him, and he does not allow them to work. And then the person who's carrying out the inspection writes, I tried to remove the chairman, but we came to the conclusion, and then he used the term gość, which is actually very informal and quite strange in a very formal report, but that means that this guy or this fellow will be, which also shows you his attitude towards him. So this guy, this Pers fellow, would be dangerous also for other reasons, meaning here clearly that his contacts with local authorities, be it German or Polish, and he can lead to problems for his environment. So I decided not to remove him, and then he processed with other steps. And of course, a particular case of such a dynamic may be seen in the places which are territories which are occupied by the Germans in mid-1941, where we don't have, as we know, where there's a large-scale destruction of Jewish communal life already happening in the first stage of the war, and where many leadership positions in these communities are actually not given to members of the old elite, though that happens too, but very often to German-speaking refugees. Though again, it happens that people, now I'm actually quoting a diary again, from among wealthier Jews or local rabbis or other community leaders are appointed as heads of the Judenrat. When we look at the Judenrat as part of the victims' experience of the Holocaust, I think what we have to remember, especially when it comes to the areas occupied in 1939 and this first stage of functioning of the Judenrat, is that those who joined it because it was a choice. They retained a degree of choice at that stage. And they joined for various reasons, depending on their own views of the situation of the community. A key role at this stage was often played by this belief, which I think was widespread and genuine, that the Jewish Council was indeed to act for the good of the community and was indeed to be a continuation of pre-war communal bodies. But of course, the Germans also had their own ways of mobilizing members of the Jewish community to join the Judenrat. A key instrument was exempting members of the Judenrat from forced labor, which, as you all know, was basically in many cases equivalent to death. They also received other benefits, including access to free healthcare, protection against requisitions of the house apartments, sometimes a pass that will allow them to temporarily leave the ghettos. And I'm again talking about territories occupied in 1939. During those which are occupied in the summer of 1941, the situation is starkly different because this is already happening after the first wave of killings. So there's different things are at stake. And in this case, as the first wave of killing often also targeted prominent members of the community, people are joining the Judenrat often because they have no choice, they're scared, and they're doing it facing death. There's also we can't deny that there's also an issue of shifting boundaries of acceptable behavior. There is growing corruption among many members of the Judenrat. And of course, for many, being member of the Judenrat or its agencies meant a significant source of additional income, meaning access to bribes and rations, food, and parcels. But this is not something I'll be talking about today. Today I'll be speaking mainly about a different part of the functioning of the Judenrat, and that's that of its actual duties, because the Judenrat early on takes over the duties of the pre-war Jewish community, as I mentioned, but it grows very quickly, and it becomes responsible for key functions which before that were taken over by the authorities, meaning organizing social welfare for the local population, refugees, coordinating food distribution, medical care, education, as well as organizing religious needs. And these needs are pressing, and they are starting even before setting up of the ghetto. And what we have to remember before we get into this is that we're talking about small localities. So we're talking about localities which are hugely impoverished even before the onset of the war, which are where very often people are a large part of the communities relying almost solely on aid from abroad, which stops or is very limited once the war starts, and also on trade or on other types of work which are hugely limited once the war, the occupation begin. And in the JDC archives, you can find quite a lot of letters from members of either aid committees, various types of aid committees, or the Judenrat themselves, where they describe situations in their villages on the onset of the war, And that is important for us to show us the context about which we're talking about. So in this letter coming from Siennica, the person writing it writes, we would like to remind you that our town, which before the war had 46 Jewish homes, so it wasn't very big, was completely burned. We only have 3 houses left. The whole Jewish population, which is about 600 souls, was left naked and without roof over their heads. We cannot, the local collections cannot fulfill even 25% our needs. At the moment when you're writing this, there are only 3 people dead, victims of cold and hunger. And then they write, which is important when we look at those numbers, that for a small town like this is really horrible. We are completely hopeless. We cannot fulfill the necessary needs of our community. The death rate grows from day to day, and God only knows what it will lead to. And another town, Wołbosz, where they write, our town is one of these which suffered the most during the war because it was burned in 75%. Moreover, this whole community goes to forced labor. So they are extremely exhausted. And again, as I mentioned, the issue of forced labor, usually associated with large cities and towns, is also a very important factor when it comes to much smaller communities. And then further down in this letter, they're actually asking the JCC for 50 pairs of trousers and 15 jackets and a few pairs of male shoes, which also shows you how different the scale is from what we know from larger ghettos, also how little they needed in order to survive. And another one, again, very, very similar, where they write, during the war, due to strong bombardment, a large part of houses in our town was completely destroyed. Among them, a large number of Jews remains without roof over their heads. And then we have, and that's a new topic which I'll mention in a moment, about 10 families which are which came here as refugees, and now they're all in a completely tragic material situation. So in order to show you where we are, I will, and I will to show you how this works. I will tell you about one case. It's the case of Włoszczowa, which we know quite well because documents from Włoszczowa were saved in the Jewish Historical Institute. And I'll tell you about the first 7 months of the functioning of the Judenrat in Włoszczowa. Włoszczowa was a community of 2,500 Jews at the onset of the war. The Judenrat in Włoszczowa is set up in October 1931 and immediately faces one of its largest challenges, which is that of a number of refugees and deportees who are coming to the town. And I also, as a side note, I'd like to tell that the Judenrat usually received very little, if any, advance notice about the masses of impoverished deportees coming to the ghetto. And that happened everywhere. It was the same in Warsaw. It's the same in a small community of Włoszczowa. So all of these people which come to Włoszczowa have no material means. They are destitute. They are in need of food. They are in need of housing, and often also, more often than not, in need of immediate medical attention because of fear of the outbreak of epidemics. And we're talking here about communities where there's often no doctors at all. And if there's a doctor, it's a Polish doctor who cannot serve them, so they have to go to another town, and so on, and so on. So the first census, which was carried out in Włoszczowa in the first month of the war, shows that we have 2,700 Jews in Włoszczowa, and the number in the first month is already increasing to over 3,000. So we have 300 extra people who are coming to the town, all of whom requiring food and lodging. Judenrat becomes an immediate campaign to provide it for them, and the only way it can fund it is by collecting donations from among the local community, which is already severely impoverished. And this is important because the Judenrat does not have any funding of its own. it's forced to pay a substantial contribution to the German authorities. And it's basically a few weeks later, the first representative from Warsaw arrive in Warsaw and seek assistance, which they get from the JDC, but quite limited. In December 39, so 2 months later, the community is enlarged by another 250 Jews who are arriving from Poznań region. They are mainly elderly people and women, against all of them destitute, and they are placed in the local Beth Hamidrash as the only place where they can be located. As author of December 1939 Judenrat report states, the lack of food and fuel provisions, a hard winter and resulting lack of transport made this work difficult to the point that it sometimes seemed completely impossible to carry out. As can be expected, there's an immediate outbreak of typhus as well in town, and the Judenrat is ordered by the Germans to build a hospital, even though it has no means at its disposal, and the hospital has to be built in 2 days. And the report of the Jewish Council states, with an inhuman effort, we managed to carry out the full refurbishment of the building designated for the hospital. Over 24 hours, 25 beds were produced, 25 bed covers were sewn, a few hundred pieces of bedding and underwear were gathered. In January 40, representatives from Warsaw come to Warsaw again to ask for more money, and in February, 440 deportees from Warsaw arrived in the town. The vast majority of them, again, ill after extremely torturous journey. At that point, Judenrat has no money whatsoever. It turns to the local community, which is unwilling to pay, unable to pay as well, and they have to use force to actually take money from those who are unwilling to pay. And on July 10th, 1940, the ghetto was established. So we are at this point talking about everything that the Judenrat has to go through, up to the use of force, before even the establishment of the ghetto. And as you can well see here, we have countless reports like this, which date from the establishment of the ghetto in JDC archives, which are talking about absolutely horrific financial situation and the attempts of the Judenrat to deal with this community. You can see this one here from Garbatka, where it tells about setting up a soup kitchen for 250 people, while 400 is actually hungry and facing death of hunger. Here again, we talk about a soup kitchen that's being set up, but then has to be closed because the Judenrat in Osiek has no funds to pay for it. Sorry. And then epidemic of red fever, which takes place in this community, and then they need to set up a hospital. And all of these mentioned, and it's very important when it comes to our understanding of the Holocaust, I think, and something that again we know from the larger ghettos, but it sort of disappears when we look at it through the prism of Warsaw, which of Krakow, because there's so many other issues that are happening that overshadow it. Is what we have to remember and think about is the role played by forced displacement in the Holocaust, and the way in which it is used as a tool of mass murder. All of the reports that I mentioned this incredible strain that's put on the community by the influx of destitute refugees and deportees who arrive in those often very small places. And what you see here is coming from a self-help committee by the Judenrat in Dobre. This is something that appears very often in JDC archives, and that's a list of that's sent to JDC after JDC provides them with some flour, and they send a sort of receipt list, right? So we have names. We can see where this person comes from. Some of them are locals from Dobre. Some of them are deportees and refugees. Then you can see the number of people in the family. We can see what they received, and this is about flour. So we can see how many kilograms of flour the family received, and then we have a signature. And you can see here that in many cases, there's nobody in a family of 5 or 7 who is actually literate, who could sign their name. so they only sign the name with those little circles. And this is, of course, incredibly important for us to understand how small ghettos functioned. But I think it's also on a day like today, on the 27th of January, it's important for one more reason, because I think if we are, and if I would like you to remember anything from this lecture, and I think this is much more important than the Schnellbrief or Hans Frank's decree, is this list and those people who are here and those three circles, which are really the only sign of the existence of huge families, which ended up in Dobre. And that's why I think we are all here for. We are all here to remember those people, and this is something that I think is very important for us, and that's why we do this work. So this is what happens. So we are talking here about the situation which happens before the establishments of the ghetto, but of course, once the ghetto is established, the situation becomes much worse, basically everywhere. I mean, it deteriorates. It deteriorates very, very quickly. And again, in the JDC archives, you can find numerous letters from the Judenräte or from Jewish self-help committees, which write that they have to tend to the JDC. They didn't do it before, but now they have to do it after the establishment of the Jewish quarter, which they refer to as a quarter or neighborhood. They don't use the term ghetto. And here they say that we communicate with you at the beginning, the third line. We communicate with you because of the setting up of our quarter, and now almost all inhabitants remained without any food supplies and without any financial means. And they write about now they feel the need to set up a soup kitchen, but the only place that they have is a prayer house. So they're asking JDC for means to refurbish it so it can serve as soup kitchen. And they're also asking for some pots and pans so they can feed people, because otherwise they will starve. It's also interesting, when you think about the role of the Jewish community before the war, and then look at it during the war in this very small place where suddenly the prayer house becomes, which they looked after, becomes a soup kitchen. And then we have another one from Sobolov, where again they say that even though they were very poor, they did not address the JDC before, but now that it's closed, the Jewish quarter is closed, all the traders and the artisans cannot work anymore. And so they're asking JDC for additional help. And also, as you can see in the last line of this letter, which shows what I spoke about before, they write that they will have about 700 refugees coming from a neighboring place, which also shows you the scale of what they're facing. In a very dramatic letter sent from Bolimov, in the third paragraph, the Judenrat in Bolimov is writing, a free bird which is not closed in a cage can still look for food in other places and maybe find something to fulfill its hunger. However, the bird which lost its freedom is now sitting locked in a cage and is sentenced to hunger. And then they write, today we find ourselves in a closed quarters for Jews. The only thing that fulfills our hunger is hope that this time you'll show mercy and you'll help us. And they write about 120 Jews which are also coming to this locality, and how completely hopeless they are. They're looking at it, and we're standing completely hopeless. And according to this, we are asking you how long we can only stay living on hope. And when we talk about the Judenrate, and mainly for the prism of larger towns, we often talk about this illusion of self-government, about this potential to make choices, about negotiating with the Germans, about trying to, find our way between Polish authorities, German authorities. But I don't think this exists in those letters, not in those which were sent from small towns. Here, people have no access to anything. They have access to Polish authorities, which are usually as hopeless and have, nothing. They don't really know anything either. They don't have any access to reliable sources of information. Anything they rely on is some gossip, some rumors, some hearsay, some letters which may arrive from larger cities, and they're completely hopeless. They're completely alone. What they have in the JDC is basically often one of the only organizations they can write to. And what is striking in those letters is something that you can see here, is that in many of those letters have an extra note at the bottom, which comes from a larger Jewish community, as destitute as the smaller one that we speak about, in which they are supporting the plea to the JDC. So this level of sort of self-help, we may say, of self-support between those completely, those communities which are facing death at that point, death of hunger, illnesses, even before the mass murder begins, is incredible. So this one comes from Opoczno, and this is a little note at the bottom of a letter from Gielniów, which they say, knowing the situation of the town of Gielniów and its inhabitants, we confirm that their plea should be fully supported by you, by the JDC, and then they sign themselves and stamp it. And here's the same thing. It's a letter from Jasienica Kościelna, I think, where they're asking about a completely destitute, where they talk about a completely destitute situation of 800 people, 300 with absolutely nothing, and the rest not being able to support them in any way. And then at the bottom of it, you have you have a note from the Jewish Council in Sanok, which says, on our side, we confirm that the data above is correct, and we strongly ask you to help them immediately. And we also have another situation like this. This is coming from Szydłów. Again, an extremely difficult situation. And I mean, it gets repetitive in a sense that they are all, they tell about extreme hunger, about the number of refugees who are coming, about the setting up of a soup kitchen, about complete lack of help from elsewhere. And in the postscript, in the second one, they also tell here about the other communities in the neighborhood and in the localities which are also in need of help. And they are also asking for help for these communities. So this is incredible, I think, when we think about the situation they're in, and that even in this situation, they are still asking for help for those around them. That's the second thing that I think is important when it comes to remembering what we talk about today. But all in all, these documents, as you can see, make for an incredibly difficult reading, because what comes out of them in time is mainly frustration, extreme pain, and this extreme feeling of being left completely alone. This letter coming to JDC from Sienna starts by, it's a reply to a JDC letter asking them for a report on what they received that year. And they write here, so what do you want us to write about? About those great monetary gifts which we received? Do you want us to write about the clothing we got, about the produce? But you know what we received. And you know exactly how little you get, but you didn't give us anything. Every time we asked it was always too late. It doesn't, the life further on, that what you gave us doesn't even fulfill 5% of our needs. The only thing we received so far from the Jewish self-help in Radom is 5 pieces of dresses for children, 5 shirts, and 5 pairs of shoes. So we're asking, who are we going to give this great gift to? For it's absolutely pointless for us to be even sharing this gift among our community, because nobody is going to believe that this is all we got, and this is just going to lead to an unrest among a community. And then they say, so we're asking, what do you want us to do with this unfortunate, very poor refugee community? Are we just meant to leave them alone? Because there's nothing else we can do. And then another one from Zaklichen, which will be the last one I'll show today, where they start by writing that the postage of our letters to join cost us more than we received from you. And then they say that we know that you won't be, touched by this letter, because we know you're helping others. But there are others who have protection, who have plets, they say, so have, someone standing behind the back, and we don't have it. We're just very impoverished. And then they say, in the very end, they say, we know that this letter will have no meaning for you because it comes from Sam Zaklichen. And this feeling of coming from Sam Zaklichen, from a place which has no importance to anyone, is something that's also coming across it. But it's thanks to archives such as this that the story of Sam Zaklichen can be recalled today. And ending with this, the second page of the document I already showed you, of people who received flour in Dobre, I think I'd like to conclude by saying that this existence of Jewish councils, of the Judenrate, was undoubtedly a key part of the Jewish communal experience of the Holocaust. One of the most important, as we know, to be communally also dealt with and examined after the war. But even though it was, of course, employed as a tool by the Germans in the later stages of the occupation, I think it should still, it should be still studied as a Jewish body and within the context of the history of the Jewish communal organizations, even if it existed in starkly different conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarzyna, for a fascinating lecture and for sharing this really moving material with us. We now open the floor to questions. Just a reminder that your microphones are turned off and to send us questions via the Q&A function. And I see that we already have a few, and I have one of my own. So I'm going to start with the general question that I see here, which is, did the members of the Judenrat believe that their lives would be spared?
That's a great question. Did they? I think that depends again on when they're joining it. I think people make decisions on the basis of calculation of costs and what's best for them, what's best for the families. People who joined the Judenrat in 1939, I strongly believe, very often join it because they see it as a continuation of the pre-war Jewish leadership. They often do it like Chernyakov, to stay with the people, to stay with the community at a difficult period of time. And they see it and they strongly believe that there will be some sort of Jewish autonomy in Poland at the time, and that the Judenrat is set up as a continuation of what existed before the war. But as I said, the situation changes very, very quickly. And for those who joined in 1941, I'm sure they must have believed that this will spare them. But I mean, if it was a rational decision to make, because of course we think about it, they do it for themselves, but they also do it for their families. And I think that's a decision that any of us would have made at that point, right? Because most of these people would do anything to save their families and those the nearest to them. So they do it for their reasons, but of course they also do it because in many cases, being a member of the Judenrat, if not all cases, also allows you slightly better living conditions than that of the remaining of the community. So it was complex decisions which were not undertaken by all in the same way. But I think the issue of survival, and again, we're talking here about simply about death in terms of executions, right? But even in the ghetto, when we have such meager food provisions or problems with housing, with access to health service, being a member of the Judenrat could mean survival, because it allowed you simply access to food. So in that sense, survival as well. Yes.
Thank you, Katarzyna. We have a number of questions about the relationship of the JDC and the Judenrat, and I'm going to now kind of group them together, if I may. So I see that I'm trying to find from the most general. I know that we have a number of questions. Well, we'll just start on this topic and then continue on that. So the first question on the joint and the Judenrat is that you mentioned JDC inspections. Could you clarify what that meant? And another question also is, can you explain why JDC was keeping documents regarding Judenrat membership?
Okay, so the reports that we have, they are going, I mean, the main reason why they're going to the community is to see in what way funding which is received from the JDC is spent, right? It's distributed within the community. This mainly in this initial period dealt with the so-called soup kitchens, which are mentioned repeatedly in those documents I presented. So a soup kitchen, which is a way of distributing food for those who don't have any other means of getting it, means that people are getting this one soup, one whatever it is, portion of food a day. Of course, that meant that it was never enough, in a sense that people who were coming to soup kitchens were basically, it was just delaying of starvation for a brief period of time. But nonetheless, they were functioning, and they were the first really step taken by the Judenrat, by the Jewish self-help, in order to provide help for the community. Immediately from the beginning of the war, soup kitchens are being set up. JDC is subsidizing functioning of soup kitchens, and they are sending they're sending people from Warsaw to inspect it simply, right, to see how that money is being spent, especially if there are any complaints from the community which happen that, for example, as I mentioned, the Judenrat is corrupted, that they are taking those means for themselves and so on. So this is the sort of inspection they're carrying out. And while they're carrying it out, they also mention the local power structures, who has control over the resources, who that money is going to, how they're distributing it. And that is really what, even though this is not the main reason for the inspection, nonetheless, this is something that provides us with incredibly important information regarding the functioning of a small unit in a small town. And I should also mention that because there's so little material that we have left, I mean, wartime materials especially, linked to those small communities, there's also relatively little material post-war, because even if there were any survivors from a very small communities, right, they wouldn't usually leave any written memoirs or testimonies. They were not part of those big collection, movements of collecting oral histories often. So these stories very often disappear very quickly. They were from people who had less, access to various public institutions, less education even, or less ways of even talking about their experience. So when we talk about small ghettos, and I'm slightly drifting off the topic, but it's important, and I didn't say that, those people simply don't have language of talking about the experience. If you were a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were very quickly a whole number of memoirs, documentation was being published, they were interviewed. They had ways, and they knew how to speak about the experience of being imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto or in Łódź or in Krakow. If you were imprisoned in a small, let's call it ghetto somewhere, which you didn't even know was a ghetto because it was open and didn't function like the ghettos that we all know about, then you had even no language to speak about. People didn't ask you questions because they didn't know how to ask questions, and you didn't answer. So these stories were completely wiped out. They were less interesting. They were less part of the mass culture even. And they just simply disappeared. And because we have so little also produced by the Judenrat, also for physical reasons. One of the documents I questioned, when they said they have no money to pay for postage to send documents to JDC, like, what did they produce? They didn't really produce any documentation. So those letters sent to JDC asking for help, and the reports of JDC inspectors are really the only thing we have left. So this is where their incredible importance lies.
In your research in the JDC archives, do you find any indication that those letters were shared with JDC board members? Were they like, are they?
Did they take it abroad?
Yes. Like once they received these letters, how did they share it with the JDC leadership? I mean, and I know that in our archives, things are a bit. It would be somewhere else, and you might have focused your research on specifically the documents in the communities. So I guess this is an interesting question as to how much board members might have known.
Yeah. This is an interesting question, one I haven't really researched, but what comes across very clearly is that in a way, unfortunately, these people are right in what they write, in a sense that the focus of all aid organizations is on big communities, is on Warsaw mainly. Because this is also where they're located. There are people who have easier access to people who are making decisions regarding aid. Also, in comparison, when you have 400,000 people in Warsaw, in comparison with 800, 400, 200 somewhere else, I mean, it's natural that also that those larger ghettos become the focus of JDCs and all the other aid organizations work. So those people feel alone, but they feel alone for a reason, I think, because they're, of course, JDC has all those organizations have very limited funding, have very limited, means at their disposal. And when they're sharing it, they are naturally focusing more on those larger communities. So I think it's these stories which are really going further up, not those of some Zakliczyn or whichever it is, small town it is, which disappears simply.
Yes, I mean, JDC's resources at the time were strained. We were helping,
of course,
refugees all over the world. So yes, it's.
And again, in Warsaw, we're talking about tens of thousands. 100,000 people who are coming to the city, and here we're talking about 15 sheds. So understandably, the scale and the needs of the community are so much larger. This thing is so much more complex. That with the meager first resources, and secondly meager also number of people who are working there, right, who are able to deal with it. It's not not surprising, to put it mildly, that this is where the focus is. It's natural. This is where it's happening, and these people are simply just there. Yeah.
I see that actually we have a number of questions about JDC's work. I'm just going to. Would JDC were JDC workers allowed to enter and leave the ghettos at will, and were the JDC offices located within occupied Poland?
That is a great question. We have offices in Warsaw and Krakow that are in the archives here. I haven't really. This is the side that I haven't looked at it yet. I so far have looked at it from the side of the small ghettos, and this is what I focused on. But we do have, of course. This comes clearly from documentation that we have officers who are traveling across Poland, and going to those small communities, which again, to their credit, is a huge thing if we think about it. I think there are so small places where those people actually take quite substantial danger in order to reach, in order to make sure that the flour is distributed the way it should be because someone complained about it. That's also an important aspect of the Jewish self-help during the war, because maybe we should also look at it this way, right? That this is not help coming from come from abroad, but it's not coming from an external body. This is still above all, a way of Jewish self-support, self-help network in occupied Poland, which is, I think, important because sometimes when we read those letters, right, they seem like they are addressing someone who's far away and who's completely external, but we should look at it as a means, I mean, above all, as a means of Jewish self-support during the Holocaust.
And linked to that question of the JDC workers being in a difficult situation, someone asked if the German government was aware of the American involvement, and if so, did it allow it, or was it done covertly?
No, they don't. I mean, up to the American entering the war, United States entering the war, they are functioning openly. Yes, absolutely, and without, also they are needed in a way. They're accepted because without them, as you can see in those letters, this is the only help that reaches those places, and the only help that can help build a hospital, without which we have an epidemic, which does not only endanger the Jewish community in a small place where we don't even have a ghetto at that point yet, right? But this is something that's going to spread and it's going to endanger the whole community, non-Jewish as well. So in that sense, they need it. They need someone to pay for hospitals because there's a typhus epidemic. This is absolutely, I mean, simply needed for survival, and affects not only Jewish but also non-Jewish communities in those very small localities.
I see that we have a few more questions, but I'm going to keep, unfortunately, because of time constraints, I'm probably going to just ask you 2 or 3 more. One question is can this information be accessed in English?
In English? No, from what I know, no. I mean, it's available online. It's available in your archives, which is, again, I'm incredibly grateful for as in name of all historians of this period. That's something that's extremely valuable. So they are accessible. The vast majority of those documents are actually written in, majority is written in Polish, some are in Yiddish, some are in German even, but they are, as far as I know, not no, they are also quite difficult. You could have also noted in those slides I showed you, they are not extremely legible. I chose the ones which are actually more clear, but a lot of them are written handwritten and not super legible.
We've had a few comments about e-score books being sources about those small ghettos. Could you say a word about?
Absolutely, this is an immensely important source for smaller communities. Again, not all of them, as we know. We have many, but they don't cover the whole array of all, especially tiny communities. And there are, of course, also specific sources, we all know. This is a source written after the war, from already a perspective of survivors, of often lone survivors of the communities. And we all know what the discussion of the Judenrat, of Jewish councils, their role in deportations, especially Jewish police, looks like in the immediate post-war period, and understandably so. This is, as I said, the Jewish councils, the issue of Jewish councils is part of the Jewish communal experience of the Holocaust, which is most widely discussed, judged, examined after the war, and it finds its way in the Itzkobische as well, in a sense that they look at the functioning of the Jewish councils from the perspective of what happens during deportations from the community or killings. So this is a little bit different. I mean, this is understandable, of course, but if we want to see this, and this is really where the JDC archives and other archives come in incredibly helpful, is they are allow us to look at this story without the hindsight of what happened later. So this extreme work carried out by the Jewish aid organizations, by the Judenrat as well, in the first period of war, which is completely overshadowed later on by what happens in the later stages, is extremely valuable. And this is not only about the Judenrat; it's basically about the whole experience of this first year of the war, which in post-war testimonies gets overshadowed by the experience of the ghetto, of hiding, of attempting to hide against the non-Jewish population, the concentration camps, forced labor camps, liberation, then the violence, post-war violence, emigration. So all of this very much overshadows this what happens in the very early stages of the Holocaust, understandably again. But when we look at these archives, we can get to this specific experience and see what immense impact it had on these people. This experience of 1939, of early 1940, which is completely disappears in post-war testimonies, and again, understandably so. But this allows us to tell this story.
And I will end with a very general question, which I think is always interesting to ask our speaker. How and why did you get into researching this topic?
I don't know, it just happens. It happens and then you're in it. There's no way out. The topic of the Judenrat, actually, I started researching from the other end, so from the post-war. I looked this particular topic. I worked in my previous research, my previous book, and my previous research topics on post-war justice, on how the Judenrat was perceived after the war. I started with the Warsaw Judenrat because I worked on the Warsaw Ghetto extensively, and then I moved to how it was discussed and perceived after the war. And then I realized that there were also other Judenrat, and then they might have been seen differently by those who survived. And what they did was also a bit different because they function in a completely different communal setting. And this is what made me really interested in those small ghettos. And hopefully that's a topic that I will manage to explore further now.
Well, thank you, Katarzyna, for sharing your research and your knowledge with us today. And thank you for all of you for joining us today on this special day. Today's webinar was recorded and will be available on the JDC Archives website in about 2 weeks. You can also find some of our past public programs there. And if you would like to stay informed about our upcoming programs, we invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter. There is a link in the chat. And we look forward to welcome you back for future programs.
Thank you.